How to make a presentation well. In this video, let's talk about the notion of conveying findings. How do we actually communicate findings to people who have to do things with them? Let's talk a little bit about how that fits into a kind of broader notion of how we convey findings. What's actually interesting and worth noting is that, again, data scientists and analytics tend to focus on what are the findings, and then how are we going to convey them to people. But sometimes it's actually real worthwhile to turn that around on its head, maybe, and spend time at the very beginning, thinking about the conveying part and not just the defining part. Because conveying findings is a story or problem of narrative structure. How are we going to tell the story? The kind of analytic narrative structure that we typically use is really very simple. It's made up of just 5 quick elements. What's the question? Where did it come from? What's the answer? How do I know the answer? How did I find that out? And finally, so what? Again, the nature tendency on that narrative structure is to focus on what's the answer and how do I know, and that's what I mean by conveying findings. But interestingly, the people to whom we're conveying may actually want to focus on different parts of the narrative, and they may learn from different parts of the narrative. In fact, most people we know learn from the process of storytelling, telling stories to each other, or being telling stories. So this has been going on forever. This is how human beings have learned from each other for centuries. In fact, a lot longer they have been writing. They've been telling stories and many centuries longer than they have been making PowerPoint slides, thankfully. Actually, there's some evidence to suggest that this is not just about technology. It's not just that PowerPoint became possible when we switched to it. It's actually a reflection of the underlying structure of the human brain that we learn better from stories than we ever will from a PowerPoint slide. And you will see some of the comments and the criticisms and the parodies of PowerPoint, but we want to make it a positive discussion and talk about being a good storyteller, because that is not in any way distinct from being an analyst. A good storyteller can better frame and discussions, better frame the decisions, and I actually think kind of help elevate the data analytic from sometimes might feel like a technical trait to much more of an art form or craft. But it's actually not easy. Storytelling is not easy. And it takes practice. The good news is that it starts with some really intuitive stuff. So consider the story of Goldilocks. It's a classic American fairy tale, and if you're not familiar with it, you can find it anywhere on the web, and it would be worth taking a read. Here is a picture that is kind of a classic illustration of the cover of Goldilocks. And if you don't know the story, you should go read it. I'm going to summarize it for you really quickly here. And it kind of goes like this. This is the core of the story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks. She goes for a walk in the forest. After a while, she comes upon a house. She knocks on the door. Nobody comes to the door. She just goes in and she finds at the table in the kitchen 3 bowls of porridge. Of course, like any little girl going for a walk in the forest, she's hungry and so she starts tasting the porridge. And she exclaims after tasting the first porridge bowl, "It's too hot." And the story sort of unfolds from there. Most of us have heard the story even once as children. We'll remember exactly what happens, right? The story sticks in all of our minds. We know it. Now imagine if, as a child, instead of being told that story, your parent had put up behind you on the wall this chart, a matrix. Peppa Bear, hair fur and brown, appetite level high, preliminary porridge assessment too hot. It's kind of funny to look at, right? And I'll tell you one thing about it. You wouldn't have remembered as a kid. Even today, you wouldn't remember the story from looking at this slide. It just wouldn't sink in, and unfortunately, this is what people often mistake in today's world for effective storytelling. Now, if they want to add a dynamic element, sometimes you'll see them tell the story like this, a kind of flow chart. Event 1, Event 2, Event 3, Event 4, or in sometimes even like a decision tree, like should she eat the porridge or not eat the porridge. If she eats it, we go down one branch of the tree. If she doesn't eat it, we go down another branch of the tree, like a simple game theory model. That doesn't get into people's brains either. Interestingly, as groups, we've started to use yellow sticky things, otherwise known as post-it notes, or try turn over revel the stories into their constituent elements and then rearrange them because you can move the post-it notes around, and there's something slightly better about the process. But how many times have you been in a meeting where someone puts up a flip chart with a bunch of post-it notes and tries to tell a story by quote walking you through the post-it notes? It's not a story that you're going to remember probably 5 minutes after you walk out of that room, even if you're actually understanding while they were talking about the story. Your mind tends to wander. And finally, we tell the story this way. Look at what happened. We draw a Venn diagram of important elements, and instantly, our eyes are drawn and our minds are drawn to the intersection between the two circles. That must be the most important part of the story. Now, none of this really helps very much. The parodies of PowerPoint have helped a little bit, at least to recognize some of what's wrong. But in the world that we live in, there's still this kind of odd and arguably kind of dysfunctional resistance to use storytelling unapologetically. It's almost as if people are looking for alternative alternatives to what is actually the very best way to move the decision-making needle from one place to another. Telling good stories actually works.